Well, let us begin. My name is James Shea. I'm the Associate Director of the International Writers Workshop, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. I'd like to begin by inviting our Dean and Director of the International Writers Workshop to share some welcome remarks with us. Professor Yort, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
Dr. Alexander Danda, Consul General of the Republic of Poland in Hong Kong and Macau, Mr. Raleigh L. Tejada, Consul General of the Philippine Consulate General in Hong Kong, and Mr. Timothy Wong, Acting Head of Arts and Creative Industries at the British Council, writers in residence, distinguished guests, and Hong Kong Baptist University faculty, staff, and students. Good evening. I'm truly pleased to welcome each of you to our 4th annual literary festival hosted by the International Writers Workshop. Our theme, Writing and Wellbeing, reflects not only the Faculty of Arts' niche research area of well-being, value, and the public good, but more broadly, it speaks to the importance of writing and well-being on both a personal and global scale, given the urgency of recent crises, from climate change to a pandemic to war in Europe. We are especially grateful to feature our 6 writers in residence who have participated in a virtual Writers in Residence program over the past 3 weeks. These esteemed writers were selected from a highly competitive pool of more than 100 applicants, and they are joining us from across the world: Colombia, Denmark, the Philippines, Poland, and the UK. Over the next few days, we will consider the ways that writing may foster personal growth, encourage mindfulness, and increased emotional well-being. Events include a panel discussion tomorrow called When Words Are Not Enough, Poets Using Illustrations, Music, Photography, and Video, in which 2 poets, Colin Hurd from the UK and Matilda Søes Rasmussen from Denmark, will discuss how poetry can be in conversation with other modes of art making. Tomorrow evening, we have a writing workshop led by Andy Brown from the UK, focused on poetry's relationship to the positive aspects of well-being, such as happiness, wonderment, and connectedness. I'm also excited about a writing workshop on Wednesday evening with the Polish novelist and documentary filmmaker Marta Dzido. She will share insights on making documentaries without professional equipment. That was correct. Finally, we have a panel discussion called The Power of Storytelling in Nonfiction that will take place on Thursday evening with Glenn Diaz, a writer from the Philippines, and Catalina Lobo-Guerrero, a journalist and nonfiction writer from Colombia. This panel will explore how narrative frameworks can be used in writing about real-life issues. I'd like to thank the IWW Planning Committee and the IWW Steering Committee for their efforts to make this festival possible. I'd also like to thank our partner this year, Sound Pocket, a Hong Kong-based collective of sound artists. Since 2004, the International Writers Workshop has been bringing the world's best writers to Hong Kong and to HKBU. We've hosted more than 130 writers from over 50 different countries and remain one of the few writers in residence programs in Asia. I hope you enjoyed tonight's opening event. Thank you for attending, and my very best wishes for a week of inquiry and fellowship. Thank you.
Thank you, Meta. It's appreciated. And thank you to everyone for attending this evening. It's my pleasure to moderate our opening conversation featuring 6 writers in residence and our very own writers from HKBU. This evening, we'll hear work by our writers in response to our festival theme, Writing and Well-Being. And we look forward to some engaging discussions. Travel restrictions did not allow our writers in residence to join us in person, but they've joined a series of online salons with Hong Kong-based writers over the past 3 weeks. And with any luck, we hope to host our writers in residence in person next spring. During the virtual residency, we also shared some sights and sounds of Hong Kong by way of audio recordings taken on Peng Chau Island, curated by Sound Pocket, as well as online videos of the greater Kowloon City area produced by the Kowloon City themed walking trail project. These slices of Hong Kong were meant to inspire our writers to reflect on the city and their own surroundings. Now, there is not a straightforward relationship between writing on the one hand and well-being on the other. Some of my favorite writers, such as the American novelist Cormac McCarthy, have a way of putting the reader in very uncomfortable positions. Yet even in the work by the most pessimistic writers, say existentialist writers like Franz Kafka and Samuel Beckett, we can find ourselves renewed and transformed. The very act of putting one's pen to paper is radically life-affirming. To say, I want there to be something rather than nothing. So it is with great pleasure that we come together tonight for an exchange between writers from all over the world. Each writer in residence will be introduced by one of my colleagues. They'll read a passage of writing that speaks to our theme and have a brief chat. We plan to conclude with an open discussion and take some questions from the audience. So let us begin with our first pairing, Colin Hurd from the UK and Dr. Tammy Ho. Tammy. Would you like, yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me? There's a lag and okay. I'm very glad to introduce you to Colin Hurd from the UK. Colin is a poet and he teaches creative writing at the University of Glasgow. He has published several poetry collections and their titles are just amazing. In 2011, for example, Colin published his first book entitled Too OK, T-O-O-OK, Too OK. I love the title. My own second poetry collection is entitled 2222, so I can relate. Dennis Cooper, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. The American critic and poet said that Colin's Too OK is full of razzle-dazzle stylings and superfine wit. Colin's second book, published in 2013, was a glove box, knives, forks, and spoons, and it was a highly recommended book in the forward prices. Apart from doing solo work, Colin has also collaborated with other artists and writers, exploring the potential of different genres of expressions. For example, Colin worked with the poet S.J. Fowler on a book of poems about the painter Oscar Stricker in 2017. And with the artist Susan Wilson, he's published The Open Wound, a volume of works in response to the scrapbooks of the poet Edwin Morgan. And those of us who are in Hong Kong is familiar with Edwin Morgan because we have a Hong Kong poet, Arthur Leung, who won the Edwin Morgan Poetry Prize in 2008. These are only some of the works that Colin has done on his own or with other writers and artists. And I hope to have an opportunity later on to ask him a little bit more about these works. Colin, I believe you have prepared some works to read to us.
Sure. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I love that the title that you just mentioned of your work, 2222. It reminds me of, I think, probably my favorite title for any collection of poems or short stories, in this case, short stories, that I can think of, which is a book by the amazing American fiction writer Diane Williams, which is just called Fine, 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 which I absolutely love. Okay, I'm going to read this poem, which has been written on the residency. Zippers. Hi, writers and writing fans. This is exciting and nerve-wracking. I just watched the interview in the Choi Key department store, the bit when he says nobody wore jeans, everybody bought zippers. This weekend, I've had some kind of virus. My muscles feel exhausted. In the past 2 years, I've become obsessed with running and Muay Thai. It's a kind of reaction to leaving a bad relationship, where I'm not kidding, I got my head hit with a mobile phone while driving in one instance down some idyllic windy Greek roads, to the point that there were all these lumps. I'm imagining myself in Tuo Kwa Wan. In the film locations, I feel like I'd get along with Gary. They filmed the new Batman in Glasgow to make it more filthy. Someone once said to me they wanted to read a book by me, but not a sarcastic one. I lost a jacket on Friday. I was running with a rucksack and I left the zippers at the top and it opened itself up as I jostled it up and down like an overly familiar poem. I had a dream where this really embarrassingly macho poet became a huge fan of my work and started citing me all the time. And my mum heard, and she was like, "This is great, I'll have to tell your father." And I was like, "No, please, no." I like the idea of poetry as an everyday commodity. To recover from the virus, I'm drinking a pink liquid. Only I know what it is. I always wear jeans, but I'd buy some zippers too, just to have them ready in case of emergency. I'm about to go training, probably too early because I still don't feel good. The pink liquid is summer fruits barley water. Sorry for being obtuse about it. Thank you. So now are we on to the conversation with Tim?
Okay, thank you so much. I can see that your writing style is very conversational. It's very relatable every day, and it flows very, very, very well. Now, I would like to ask you a few questions about your writing and your writing practices. So my first question, I'm curious about your various collaborations. As I said earlier, you do not only write poetry on your own, you also have the tendency to collaborate with other writers, artists, and especially on artistic, different artistic genres. So can you tell us more about these collaborations? How do you select your collaborators, for example, and how do you select the projects that you work on, and why is art so important in your selection?
Thanks so much. That's such an interesting question, and there's so many different directions to it, and some of them I think will open up even more tomorrow in the conversation that was mentioned in the beginning about the kind of when words are not enough, the kind of the visual side of things and things. But I will try and answer it here as well. Just as a little bit of background, before I started working here at Glasgow University, I had a gallery which I ran along with someone else in Edinburgh. So we showed visual artists. It's just a small space, but we would put on exhibitions and yeah, we just were kind of constantly showing a kind of rotating program of visual artists, sometimes in group exhibitions, sometimes in solo exhibitions. So I just was around a lot of visual artists, and I would kind of see often the way that they were working and kind of go into their studios and things like that. And really projects just started to grow from that. So the Open Wound project, which there were actually a couple of projects sort of kind of melded together there in what you described, but the Open Wound was a project with an artist called Cat Outram, and that was shown at the Royal Scottish Academy. And she's an amazing printmaker who had self-taught as a printmaker and had made an amazing career and had been really quite successful making prints, very beautiful prints of Edinburgh, and they were very popular and very sensitive and you know, really to my mind, really beautiful prints of Edinburgh. But she wanted to do something slightly more conceptual, something slightly more ambitious. And so she put forward this proposal to the Royal Scottish Academy, and it was for this sort of television screen with a kind of concertina book sequence of prints kind of spilling out of it. And she asked me, she showed me some of her initial workings for the prints, and then I wrote a poem based on those, and then she kind of made some more prints and kind of extended that and kind of imagined the whole project sort of from that. And that was actually, I hadn't thought of it so much just now, but it was the full title was The Open Wound, and then in brackets, In My Living Room. And it was the idea of kind of having this open wound of kind of shock, like watching news come in from a television screen. And it was when there was I think that was made when there was the war, in the first kind of phase of the war in Syria. And so it feels very relevant just now as well, watching this, you know, watching a war play out, you know, from a screen. Collaboration for me is absolutely sort of at the heart of writing. You know, writing, people often think of writing as being a very kind of solitary activity. And obviously there is that side of it. Sometimes you are just in a room yourself, kind of really working through material or like working on your work and things. But even when you are doing that, you're doing it through your experiences of the art you see, the people you meet, the conversations you have. And that was, I really noticed in lockdown that I definitely, I mean, slightly, there were other things going on in my life, and I definitely slightly changed my kind of focus a little bit. So that probably accounts for it as well. But I definitely found that not going out to exhibitions, not going out to poetry readings, not encountering other writers as much and having those kinds of conversations and hearing other people's work, I find it much harder to write and much harder to kind of generate ideas and come up with things to say. So for me, collaboration, even when work is kind of single authored, it's still collaborative in the sense that it is still about engaging in, and it still comes from conversations that we have. So the idea of the kind of solitary artist and like that any work is solely produced by one person, I can see why stuff gets marketed in that way, but it never is. It's always, I think art always emerges more from communities than it does from individuals.
Okay. Thank you. I'm aware of time, so maybe just one more question. I have prepared a lot more. So we know you're a lecturer in creative writing at the University of Glasgow. How has teaching creative writing informed your own writing? This is actually a question I would like my colleagues in the Department of Humanities and creative writing to talk about as well. And do you ever teach your students your own work?
No, I never teach students my own work in the sense of setting my own work. I don't have any, like, I would feel just slightly uncomfortable about that. But I don't see why other people shouldn't do that if they, because I actually think it is quite important that students understand that you go through the same challenges with your work that they're going through. So I would actually be more likely to sort of teach. I've never done it, but I would be more open to the idea of teaching something at kind of draft stage, or like, you know, like sort of sharing a draft and kind of talking to students openly and kind of authentically about the problems that I'm having with it or something like that. But the other question about how has teaching changed the way I approach my work, I love teaching. So I really, like when I'm actually, like when we're actually teaching, like everyone will know universities have their own kind of like there's other parts of the job that aren't as kind of instantly as enjoyable as teaching. But when you're teaching, the sense of talking to students about their work, seeing just their creativity, seeing their the way they find solutions and kind of have their minds kind of open to different possibilities is just constantly inspiring to me. And you know, I sometimes sort of chastise myself because I sit in conversation. I love all kinds of different teaching, but I love kind of one-on-one conversations about students' work, where you hear them talk about their work or their ideas for a project, and they maybe, like, you know, they come in and they sort of say, yeah, I don't really know what I'm going to do. I don't have so many ideas. And then you just ask them what they're interested in, or what they, you know, like think they might do, or something, and you gradually start to see their kind of imaginations get going, and when they, you know, you just kind of challenge them and encourage them to think more in depth, or more kind of excitedly and expansively, like, you know, really think that, like I've had, I mean, you all will have, but I've had students who have done, you know, really incredible kind of, like, I've for a few years I've run the undergraduate dissertation program, and students have done kind of performances for their dissertations, or exhibitions for their undergraduate writing dissertations. And like, we had somebody who primarily did work as kind of like mobiles, like you know, hanging mobiles, and they would hang them in windows, and they made, this was actually during COVID, and they would film them from like outside the window, and you would see like just the turning, the kind of poem, different lines of the poem turning as a mobile, and just that sort of like ambition, like, and I feel like that level of commitment and level of sort of just actually believing in what you want to do and trying it out is the absolute most important thing. I also think that student writers often remember, which is sometimes more common for published writers to forget, the thing that June Jordan says in a poem, which is, "My heart is not peripheral to me." And I think, especially in academic contexts, we can sometimes fall into the kind of pattern of forgetting that our hearts are not peripheral to us. And students, I think, always remember that. So I find that very inspiring.
Thank you so much. James?
Yes, thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Colin. Just a quick reminder to the audience, you're welcome to input any questions into the Q&A chat, into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them toward the end of the event. Let's turn to Glenn Diaz from the Philippines and Jason Polley. Jason teaches in the Department of English Language and Literature. His creative nonfiction books are Refrain and Cemetery Miss You. He regularly contributes book reviews to Cha and to Proverse, as well as poetry to Voice and Verse, and to other Hong Kong affiliated venues. His academic fields include Indian English fiction, experimental criticism, comics nonfiction, and world literatures and Englishes. He recently co-edited an essay volume called Poetry and Pedagogy, Intersections Across and Between the Disciplines. So, Jason.
Hi, everyone. I'm just kind of, I see Glenn Diaz's biography here while you were saying mine. So I'm a little bit confused, but here we go. I will just read my introduction to Glenn Diaz, which I hope you can hear while you're also reading a screen that is very different from what I'm about to intone. Glenn Diaz is a Pinoy tree philosopher doing a PhD in creative writing at the University of Adelaide. That's how I quickly learned to encapsulate him. I employ the tree philosopher label carefully. No, actually, I intone the tree philosopher appellation reverentially. Reverentially because as someone who hand planted 500,000 spruce and pine seedlings in the mosquito-plagued and moon-visible clear-cuts abutting the Alaska Highway, this in order to finance my BA studies, I too lived for, which is the same as living because of, trees. First, trees grounded me, then trees opened the world to me. Glenn Diaz's pasabulong, his travel gifts, his experiences made epic word, even in micro-story form, integrate references to Dante, Balagta, Carpentier, Boulosan, Conrad, and Atkinson. Diaz's philosophical peregrinations, performed in fictional and non-fictional forms, likewise integrate Egyptian, Greek, biblical, and Mayan figurations. As such, not unlike the Filipino Ilustrato of old, but from a grassroots in lieu of a top-down subject position, Diaz returns the world to the Philippines, a world he sees centered not in nature as standing reserve, to quote Heidegger, but rather in trees qua trees, tout court. Diaz's mission, we might argue, is to keep la selva oscura, to keep the woods dark. Only then do we fully license the life, the well-being of trees, and by extension, ourselves and our inheritors. So I'd like to now open the space for Glenn to read something to us, please.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Jason. Such a generous and penetrating introduction. So yeah, I'll be reading exactly from that project, now from a work in progress. It is a hybrid nonfiction project now that's part poetics, part memoir, part like history, critique of knowledge production, etc. All these wonderful things that I started during the pandemic, and which I managed to work on during the residency, and partly because of that, I think it's inherently an attempt to sort of make sense of like the end of days, the continuing end of days feelings now of the world right now, and therefore I hope addresses the idea, the proposition of well-being in some way. So the title of the work is "When the World Ended, It Was Thinking About the Forest." Number one, like Dante when Inferno opens, 35 years old, in the middle of the journey of our life and face to face with una selva oscura, Florante in Balagtas's Florante at Laura, tied to a tree deep in the middle of Gubat na Mapanglao, a gloomy forest, lamenting the fate of his forsaken republic. The weary composer in Alejo Carpentier's Los Pasos Perdidos, journeying to the earth's most ancient jungles, a world of deceit, subterfuge, duplicity. The Cold War era guerrillas at the outset of an important mission in Carlos Bulosan's unfinished The Cry and the Dedication, their shadows falling upon the hushed silence of the great forest. Marlowe during a quiet moment in Heart of Darkness when the wilderness seemed like something great and invincible, like evil or truth, and so on. Only in my case, the forest might well be the world, constantly ending in the banal, all-consuming way enabled by the manic transparency of globalization, the traffic of images blitzing vertically on screens, images such as the silhouette of a kangaroo stone still against mammoth flames. In Melbourne, on a quick stopover, I found a city blanketed in smog from the bushfires ravaging the southeast part of Australia. In nearby Adelaide, where I was pursuing graduate studies, I woke up in the middle of the night smelling smoke, apparently from a conflagration from Kangaroo Island off the coast. Hazy on good days Manila, to where I'd returned for a research trip that the pandemic appended, was itself swathed in ashfall from an erupting volcano somewhere south. Adrift in my last-minute pasalubong list was an N95 mask, the supply of which was reportedly running low at home. There was something planetary about the sense of doom that was foretold by this inescapable scarcity of masks. In a podcast interview, Kate Atkinson said every civilization must have harbored a sense that they were the last, that the end of the world was nigh. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Mayans. What's so different about this one? Asked the anchor, the referent darkly left out. We're probably right, Atkinson said. The world is infernal forest, the apocalypse ferried across by a roof of smoke, the grief of burning trees. Number two, the history of the world, we might venture to say, is the history of forests. Number three, in the Bible, it is a gift bequeathed to the just created universe on the third day. Quote, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. The nice-sounding staccato points to the intelligently cyclical regeneration at the heart of flora, the blueprint for forests, if not the natural world in general, outside the intervention of capitalists and plantation owners, who wouldn't be created until epochs later anyway, not counting the first Homo erectus, who speciated from habilis by taking a fallen branch to make the world's first controlled fire somewhere in Eurasia 1 million years ago. In the Philippine Constitution, the first reference to it arrives quite late, after the Bill of Rights, the flurry of principles undergirding the country's state-making project. On Article 12, National Economy and Patrimony, it is among the natural resources, including minerals and coal and, quote, all sources of potential energy that are, quote, owned by the state. articulated into being to be possessed, subsumed under a default market economy. In Amado Guerrero's Philippine Society and Revolution, it is also resource, but the bureaucratic and extractivist ethos is replaced by what sounds almost like a lament on a kind of bounty that is seized from the people to whom it belongs. Quote, the country has vast mineral, marine, and power resources. Its forests cover a little over 1/3 of the land. On paper, Guerrero says, these are enough to sustain a population that is several times bigger than the present one, if only the violence of history, of American imperialism and feudalism and bureaucrat capitalism were out of the picture. If the Constitution encloses the lifeless forest as merely land under public domain, in the communist text, it is home to sentient struggle. Settlers on the hilly regions and forest zones of the country are a major phenomenon due to the semi-colonial and semi-feudal character of Philippine society. Dispossessed peasants who find neither agricultural nor industrial employment in places from which they have migrated. It appears 2 more times in the book in the context of rapacious land grabbing by encomenderos during Spanish rule and the plunder of natural resources under martial law. The forest as largesse, linchpin of development, contested bounty. Thank you.
Great, thank you for reading that. I've read it over several times, and yeah, I'm always amazed. I just love what you were doing here. So I'm just going to ask a couple general questions. And I'm sorry if this annoys Tammy Ho, because I always ask this question, but I think it's an important question. Can you tell me about code mixing? I mean, just in me reading that, I'm only able to recognize the Tagalog and the Spanish and the English, but you may have encoded more. And I just want to, can you tell me about your choices as to your language choices and why?
Yeah, sure. I think it's an important question, especially for like post-colonial writers or writers who write in a colonial language, originally colonial language. I think I don't know, that's something quite unique to like Filipino writers in English, for instance. Now, when you write in English, so I don't know, you think of your audience, but at the same time you're conscious that like people other than Filipinos can read it. So I suppose it's something that you constantly problematize, either like wittingly or unwittingly in your mind. So I think in my case, like considering my politics and considering the kind of audience and readership that I have in mind, I have to like tell myself that I'm reading for a Filipino audience, and it just happens that non-Filipinos can read my writing because I write in English. So because I think when you write in English, I think something happens when you're writing that you're like considering an outside audience, and that kind of dilutes, I think, sometimes the politics in the writing, and you're forced to or invited or encouraged to sort of pander to an outside audience. So I think it's something that I constantly wrestle with. And yeah, I mean, the matter of language is only like obviously like tip of the iceberg in terms of like the overall things that you want to do in your writing, but it's something that I constantly think about because I do write in English. So and considering all the baggage and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it is like an historical feature, because when I think of the Philippines and early Filipino writing, I might go back to Jose Rizal and Noli Me Tangere, and here you have like this Filipino text, but written in Spanish.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think you can be completely like purist and nativist about it. You're right. No, Rizal wrote in Spanish, but I don't think that like dilutes the the politics, the nationalist, whatever of the project of his writing. So I think there's room to, I think, or write in English, but still, be politically aware, be politically conscious, instead of like just looking at writing in English as like, like kowtowing to like, colonial impositions.
And have you had any encounters where someone might ask you why you are not writing in Tagalog or in Bisaya or another Filipino language, and why are you writing in the language of our usurpers?
Sure, right, and yeah, specifically for my work, I write about empire and history and colonization. So obviously the matter of English, like the imposition of English at the turn of the 20th century, is like an important, if not like the most important facet of like the American occupation, etc. All these now. So yeah, it is a valid point, I think, and I am trying to write in Tagalog, in Filipino, my first language. So I suppose it's really a matter of I don't know, being aware or being conscious of what history has done to us as Filipino writers, and coming to terms with the fact that English is simultaneously a baggage, but at the same time it can also be used to write about political things, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, it might be an interesting exercise for you to get someone to translate some of your work for you into Tagalog, even though it's one of your languages. I'm just saying that because when we had Miguel Sihuco here, maybe close to a decade ago, I had a student who was half Filipina, half Hong Konger, and her name was Sherilyn, a very famous student at BA English program many years ago. And she translated Miguel Sihuco, a section of his book, into Tagalog. And he really liked the experience of being an other, approaching his own text in his own language as well. But, he's also, as his book title, Ilustrado, there's an Ilustrado element to him too, traveling around and coming back from the US, not unlike yourself. I think that Miguel was doing his PhD in Australia as well, right?
We went to the same program, actually.
Okay, same program, right? So that's really interesting, right? So the other question I wanted to ask, because I'm aware of the passage of time, when was that Article 12 of the Filipino Constitution penned?
This particular one, I think the specific wording of it comes from the 1987 Constitution. But I think that's completely, I think that's copied from like the 1935 Constitution, which is an American era constitution. So like many of the legal institutions, the idea of democracy for the Philippines came from the US actually. So yeah, it's certainly influenced by that.
Because it's really interesting how the language of there are enough trees for our people, but I think we're all aware that the population of the Philippines has gone from 10 million to 110 million just in the past 100 years or so.
Sure.
So
yeah.
in the passage since that was first written, I imagine the amount of trees in the Philippines has been radically reduced while your population has by a factor of 10 multiplied, right? So the trees per person kind of ratio has changed dramatically, even since the 80s.
Sure.
Without even thinking about from the 20s or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, it's ever more important that we focus on these lines. Oh yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for this, Glenn. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to talking to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Glenn. It's interesting that, your prose and Colin's poetry couldn't be more different, and yet they're both extremely discursive. And so I wonder, is there something about this moment that demands that kind of discursive? I think is the root of it means to run about, like we're all on the run right now. Let me move on to Marta, Zito, and Dorothy Tse. So Dorothy is a fiction writer in Chinese who teaches in the Department of Humanities and Creative Writing. She's published 3 short story collections and a novel, and has received the Hong Kong Biennial Award for Chinese Literature. She also co-founded the literary magazine Fleur de Lettres. Dorothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. I'm very honored to introduce Marta Dzido, one of our writers in residence. Marta is an award-winning Polish writer and documentary filmmaker. Through her work, there is even in different media, there seems to be one main theme, women's liberation, not only socially, politically, but also sexually. Her novel, Frida, translated in English as Søes, which won the European Union Prize for Literature, for example, is a love story that explores the language of sensuality and bodily experience in a culture that is relatively conservative about sexual topics. The novel is written from a rather unusual point of view, which is written in second person, from the perspectives of both the female and the male protagonist. Although the you is addressing the 2 lovers in the novel, it also seems to address the reader and invites us to feel more deeply the intimacy and emotion of the characters. Marta's work is a critical response to human condition, and today she will share a piece written as a reflection to the recent outbreak of war in Europe. Please welcome Marta Dzido.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for this introduction. I wish my piece of writing was about something else, but when we started our online residency, I was trying to be inspired by sounds and sights of Hong Kong. But unfortunately, on the third day of residency, of our online residency, the war began. I wish I could continue exploring my writing themes like women liberation, like sexuality. I wish I could share with you a piece of writing about well-being, about love, about positive emotions, but I wouldn't. I wrote a text from my Polish perspective, observing the tragedy of our Ukrainian friends, and my mind and my emotions are in Ukraine now. I realized that me, as a granddaughter of those who survived the Second World War, I feel emotions and reflexes I did not fully understand. It's a kind of transgenerational trauma, and this text is about that. I'm going to read it in Polish to give you a kind of Polish language melody, but you can follow the text in English on the screen. Słowo na W. Tylko oni wiedzieli, co znaczy to słowo. Czym pachnie, jak smakuje, gdzie boli najbardziej. Ile czasu się goi, jakie zostawia blizny. Woleli nie wypowiadać go na głos, szczególnie przy nas. Byliśmy wtedy jeszcze dziećmi. Trzeba nas było chronić. Wiedzę o tym, co ich spotkało, zdobywaliśmy przypadkiem, nie rozumiejąc. Bo dlaczego dziadek zawsze nosił w kieszeni kromkę chleba, a babcia, słysząc wystrzały noworocznych fajerwerków, zamiast cieszyć się i oglądać na niebie kolorowy spektakl, uciekała do łazienki? No właśnie. Dlaczego? Dziwni starsi ludzie, ich niezrozumiałe zachowania, gromadzenie mąki i świec na czarną godzinę. Po co to komu, skoro do sklepu 5 minut? Czym jest ta czarna godzina? Nikt nam nie wytłumaczył, ale czuliśmy wtedy, że nie można sobie z tego żartować. To zbyt poważne. Oni coś przeżyli, coś pamiętają. Ale co? Dla nas to słowo było zabawą. Biegaliśmy po podwórku z karabinami z patyków, wrzeszcząc tra-ta-ta-ta i bum bum bum, kryliśmy się za drzewami, robiliśmy uniki, padaliśmy na ziemię ranni albo martwi, tylko po to, by za moment wstać i walczyć dalej. My napadaliśmy na tamtych. Innym razem tamci atakowali nas. Do utraty sił, aż nam się znudziło. Aż mama wyjrzała przez okno i krzyknęła: obiad! Wtedy trzeba było wojnę szybko skończyć, posilić się kotletem mielonym z mizerią albo pomidorówką z ryżem i z pełnym brzuchem można było strzelać od nowa. Nie rozumieliśmy, ale odmienialiśmy to słowo przez wszystkie przypadki, prawie na każdej lekcji. Historia, przyczyny wojny, przebieg wojny, skutki wojny. Język polski. Kiedy przyjdą podpalić twój dom, stań u drzwi, bagnet na broń, trzeba krwi. Geografia. Przed wojną granica biegła wzdłuż rzeki, a teraz pasmem gór. Fizyka. Jeżeli pocisk wystrzelony został z prędkością, i tak dalej. I tak w kółko. Słowo na W. Jego brzmienie jak brzemię w czasie przeszłym dokonanym, bo jakżeby inaczej, nigdy w odniesieniu do nas samych. Gdy pytaliśmy babcię, co się bawiła, jak była mała, odpowiadała: ja nie miałam dzieciństwa, okupacja mi wszystko zabrała. Więc szliśmy do dziadka, ale on milczał. Czasem tylko zdejmował z regału wielką muszlę, przykładał ją do mojego ucha, pytał: słyszysz? Fale łagodnie uderzają o brzeg. Szumi wiatr. W oddali skrzeczą mewy, łopoczą skrzydłami. Tam jest bezpiecznie. tam słychać spokój. Słuchaliśmy uważnie i zaczynaliśmy powoli rozumieć, że słowo na W, którego babcia i dziadek nie chcieli wypowiadać na głos, ma moc bezpowrotnego zniszczenia. Paraliżuje, ogłusza hukiem, robi w sercu wyrwę, zostawia za sobą pożogę. Śmierdzi prochem i mordem. Śni się koszmarem, ściska klatkę piersiową, zabiera oddech. Wydobywa się z płuc głuchym wyciem, aż w końcu budzi w środku nocy, dając do zrozumienia, że wszystko, co straszne, co minęło, wciąż siedzi w głowie. Gnieździ się w zakamarkach duszy, nie chce odejść. Dorastaliśmy w mieście, w którym nie sposób było iść na spacer, nie natrafiając na miejsca pamięci. Pamiątkowe tablice na ścianach budynków. Tu zginęło tylu i tylu, tu rozstrzelano tylu i tylu, tam spłonęło, tam zbombardowano, tam zgładzono. Przyjeżdżali turyści z zagranicy. Dziwili się, że stolica taka brzydka, że nie ma prawdziwej starówki. Tłumaczyliśmy, że Warszawa, Warsaw, znaczy war, saw the war. To miasto widziało wojnę. Kiwali głowami, no tak, i czym prędzej jechali zwiedzać zabytki Krakowa. Żyliśmy uśpieni, naiwną wiarą, że to już się więcej nie zdarzy. A przynajmniej nie nam, nie w naszym świecie, nie na naszej szerokości geograficznej. Syci i rozleniwieni dobrobytem, bezpieczni do dnia, w którym tamci wdarli się na teren naszych sąsiadów. Świat się zatrzymał i nie wiedział, co robić. Bo może to wewnętrzna sprawa, nie nasz ten konflikt, propaganda, fake news, a wtedy tamci zrzucili bomby na przedszkole. Wozami opancerzonymi rozjechali placyk zabaw. Rozstrzelali dziewczynkę. Nic już nie jest, jak było. Słowo na W jest na ustach nas wszystkich. Codziennie po przebudzeniu patrzę w wiadomości. Sprawdzam, który z moich przyjaciół logował się w ciągu ostatnich 12 godzin. Jeśli jest ślad, oddycham z ulgą, żyją. Olech 5 godzin temu. Szuka w Charkowie ludzi do pomocy w ewakuacji niepełnosprawnych. Julia 8 godzin temu. Organizuje transport z Lwowa na zachód. Sarhi 2 godziny temu. Filmuje zniszczenia w Buczy. Juri 10 minut temu. Siedzi w schronie w Tarnopolu. Napisał wiersz. Andrii online. Publikuje apel. Błaga świat o pomoc. A świat? Nie ma już przy mnie babci i dziadka. Nie zapytam ich, jak teraz żyć. Co będzie dalej? Co świat może zrobić, by to zakończyć? Siedzę w bezpiecznym miejscu i zżera mnie bezradność. Czarna godzina trwa znacznie dłużej niż 60 minut. Zdejmuję z regału wielką muszlę, która kiedyś należała do dziadka. Przykładam do ucha, nasłuchuję. Czekam na szum fal, na łagodny wiatr, na spokój, na odpowiedź. Głucha cisza. Jutro nasypię do muszli ziemię. Włożę kilka nasion, będę podlewać. Może się uda, może wykiełkują. Nie pozostaje mi nic innego, jak mieć nadzieję. I pisać dalej. Dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marta, for this timely piece. I mean, you don't have to say sorry at all. I mean, I feel like, of course, you're in Europe, like you feel much closer to the war. I think everyone in the world feel connected. Through these few years, we are in different kind of disaster. And when I'm on social media, everybody is talking about the war. So thank you very much. And let me ask you a question. Like we just read from your piece, you're talking about the history of Poland and the shadow of war when you're growing up. Can you just like, I think this piece is also in the spirit of your other writing that I see. I think your writing is a kind of action, a gesture to resist the violence and inequality in the world. Can you tell us a little bit more about the literary tradition that helped to form you as a writer or a filmmaker? Thanks.
My other works, my previous books and films and documentary films, there are deal with the Polish history, Polish and European history, and I tell stories about a solidarity movement, for example, about a women liberation movement that took place 100 years ago, how women got the rights to vote, and what I observed and what I know from that work is that history repeats itself, and this knowledge is a kind of that scary me today, because I observed that some things that are going to repeat, and we didn't expect that. We didn't even think about it. But your questions was about what kind of literature, what kind of books shaped me as a writer, as a filmmaker. I remember that when I was a little girl, my grandma gave me a book of Polish writer Eliza Orzeszkowa, entitled Marta. The title is the same as my name, and I remember I was really touched by the story of women from the beginning of the 20th century. She was a widow, and she was trying to manage herself to survive with her young kid. And I think that was the first moment I realized that there is a kind of inequality, injustice that we women can suffer from.
Thank you. I know that today you're not reading from your work that is on the topic of women, but I'm still curious to know, as you talk about, you're concerned about females' right, women's right in Poland. Can you tell us a bit more how you feel as a female writer, being a female writer in Poland? How's your experience?
First of all, I'm a writer. And the second, that I am a female writer, so this is something different, because I am trying to speak about contemporary problems, contemporary issues from my perspective, my own perspective. And of course, I'm a woman, and I realize that my perspective is different because of my gender, because of my sex, and I discovered that female involvement in creating history is forgotten, because of course we know about brave and very important men that create our history, but I realized that most of women are in the shadow. And what I am trying to do, I'm trying to give them voice. For example, as I mentioned about solidarity heroines, women who created solidarity movement. Even in Poland, they were unknown, and I was trying to introduce. I was trying to interview them and to give them kind of a space to speak about their own experiences that are quite different from male perspective.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a last question. You are a writer and also a filmmaker. How do you find these two media different? Like, what advantage and disadvantage of these two mediums in your creative process? Can you tell us, and which media do you prefer more?
It's very difficult to answer the questions and to indicate which media I prefer more. It depends on the topic. It depends on what I would like to speak about. But of course, all of it, it's about telling history, about telling stories. When I was trying to speak about non-fiction events, I prefer to make a movie, to make documentaries, to show some evidence, to share some audiovisual materials that that we can observe. And writing give me it's a kind of a challenge to speak about when I would like to speak about emotions, when I would like to explore a sensuality, explore a relation between people, I choose writing.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Dorothy. And so we turn from Marta, a fiction writer who's also a filmmaker, to Matilda Rasmussen, who is a poet and also a performance artist and visual artist. So Matilda Rasmussen and Patrick Holland will be next. Patrick is my colleague in the Creative and Professional Writing program in the Department of Humanities and Creative Writing. He's a novelist and author of 7 books, including The Merry Smokes Boys and The Darkest Little Room. His work has been recognized by international awards such as the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and has been translated into Italian and Japanese. Patrick.
Sorry. Thanks very much, James. Look, it's my great pleasure today to introduce Matilda Søes Rasmussen. Matilda is a Danish-Swedish writer, a model, a photographer and filmmaker who, in her own words, was born and raised in the Jutlandic village of Arling in 1990 and is presently based in the world. Her debut book of text and photographs, Unprofessional, was released last year and has already been gaining accolades, such as a shortlisting for the Photo Textbook Award at the 2021 Rencontre des Arts. Matilda's work just gives an incredibly authentic and unique look into a world I think very few of us ever see, at least not see it as she does, which is high fashion and elite nightclubs and that kind of thing. It's quite unique, and the hybrid nature of the work also is quite unique. I've never read anyone quite like Matilda, so I'm really excited to have her here. So welcome, Matilda, and we'll be pleased to hear you read.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for the introduction. I will be reading 2 short texts. The first one is from my debut book from last year. And it's called You Look Like a Baby Doll, Do You Smoke Hash? All the 18-year-olds have beautiful smiles and sexy dance moves they have refined in Asian nightclubs. My feet are stiff and my ankles are swollen from the flight. They stand still like Greek columns in my boots. My hips of exactly 89 centimeters move slowly like galaxies around their own axis. I must endure, maybe try to photograph if I dare. We order food from a special model menu consisting of salads. I ask for a glass of white wine, and 5 minutes later, the waiter comes back to announce that they only have bread. I get a beer, drink half, go to a toilet overshot by models on cocaine cut with laxatives. Back at the bar, I'm scared that someone has drugged my beer. When we're about to leave, the thin-haired owner tells us we can't. The non-verbal contract goes something like this. Eat and drink, and I own your presence for the night. I tell you where to sit in the bar. I tell you when you can leave. I also tell you how to dress, and if you don't obey, I won't let you in. But if you flirt with me, I might let you in anyway. When we are finally allowed to leave, he pays us a couple of $100 yuan for the presence of our bodies. And the second text that I wrote during this residency is called Love is a White Toyota Hiace. Once I was a child with the same hairstyle as I have now. I start in the middle because I can't remember the beginning. There is no roof. We live in a cabin tent in the garden. The thunders last for a whole summer, and we sleep on piles of moss in cabins of softened polyester, pale yellow and brown, bleached by the sun. There are many ants in the garden, and there are many pines on the slope out back. Babu babu to the emergency room, you say, and point to the small fat pockets of resin that you can squeeze straight into the eyeball. I bury a bird here, and in the garden we bury Pelle, the cat who was run down by some pig who deserves to burn in hell. I throw a harlequin checkered metal cone with dry cat food into the grave and wish death upon the driver. Now the cat is lying in the middle of the garden, right where the tent stood. My sister lives upstairs on the artificial green carpet. Her dresser is made out of banana boxes, and her absence makes the top floor feel haunted. One day she comes home and screams she wants to kill herself with a knife, I think. I don't know what happened to that plan. On another day, she cries because the bank won't give her a loan, and my father is so angry he drives the car into town and transfers his own and my sister's savings to another bank account. But my mother's and mine remain in the old bank, and it always made me uneasy to think that he only transferred their savings and not ours, as if we were not a unit, as if we were different enclaves in the same house, and it was okay to split us up. One year they gave me the same Christmas present, a CD. The secret is that they sleep in 2 different rooms. They do not talk over dinner, but address each other through me. When she moved out at 16, I went to her room and found the old teenage magazines that had erotic fiction in the back pages. On a motorhome trip to Norway, I rape a teddy bear, and I don't know if there is so much more to say about that. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Matilda. Lovely stuff. If I can bounce off your first work, Unprofessional, from which you took You Look Like a Baby Dog, Do You Smoke Hashes? It's largely based on your experience modeling in Asia, in Japan, Hong Kong, and China. And I think just reading it, particularly capturing aspects of modeling, the modeling world that would never be recorded in Vogue or, Bazaar or these places, a kind of almost shadow image or a negative image of it. And similarly, the writing meditates on that kind of unseen world of modeling. I know you've spoken about like being on stay, I think is what you called it in your first modeling assignment in Tokyo, where kind of you just go there, you're all alone and you're isolated, but yet you go to these parties, like you're invited, although it's kind of off the books, but you get invited to these clubs and, it's kind of very transactional. And then in the piece you just read, like the cocaine cut with laxatives and the effects of that, the couple of $100 for the presence of our bodies, just constantly that negative image, that shadow image. And a study, I think, as someone has, another reviewer has put it, a study of a body constantly being assessed, bought, sold, and admired. And so I guess first up, am I right to see this as like a chief concern of your work? And what do you think your work has revealed about that kind of shadow image, or that negative image of the modeling world in Asia, perhaps particularly, but yeah.
Yeah, not just in Asia, it's pretty much the same everywhere, but it gets, I think, when you are traveling as a model, it gets extra pronounced when you are somewhere else where you don't really understand everything that's going on. But I like that you call it a negative image, because I work with photography. And I work with analog photography, and I have a line in my book that reads, why is the negative always more beautiful than the positive? And yeah, I guess my writing is, of course, critical of this industry, but I'm also so immersed in it, and I take advantage of it as well.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not like it's just a catalogue of victimization at all. The girls can give it back, and they know how to negotiate this space a lot of the time.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I mean, that I find super interesting. And just, you always see perspectives of this kind of thing almost imagined by other writers. I think what's really unique about you is that you get under the skin and you can really see what is happening there. Yeah, look, it's just wonderful. But I guess if I could ask a technical question, I know you've spoken about the relationships of images and text in your work, and you didn't want one to be a pure illustration of the other. How do you see those two working together in a work like Unprofessional?
Yeah, this was a difficult one. When I made the book, I was advised many times to not put the text there because for some reason it's difficult to pair image and text. And I totally agree because it is very easy for one to become just like an explanation for the other. I think, you know, that, yeah, what did I end up on? I don't know. I think I just knew that it was right to pair the two. And, you know, I don't, usually I don't speak about certain images in text. I feel like the texts are almost like also a photograph in themselves. Like, yeah, if you know, go from page to page, for me, I want the text to feel like you're watching a photograph almost.
Right.
So I guess like it's these small texts, all of them that are very, yeah, they are very random. They are not in any particular order, and the same goes for my pictures.
Right. No, they're very imagistic. Yeah. Do you find it easier to write? Can you understand more, or else can you understand something different about that kind of sort of almost, well, that transactional use of the body, I guess, in modeling, like, or as I say, being always assessed. There's always a sense that you're being assessed. Like I can remember once you said, like in Tokyo, you get too old for modeling in Tokyo, like super young. So you have to end up going to Hong Kong, like that, like constant sense of being assessed. Does writing give you an extra advantage to explore that, that maybe pictures don't, or and how?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think, you know, when I'm shooting myself, I'm also assessing myself.
Right.
And in a way, because I work a lot also with self-portraiture in photography, but when I'm writing is maybe a moment where my physical body is not present.
Right.
Yeah, and somehow that is also very freeing because I look at my face and my body so much all the time, and it has become kind of like a scary thing that I'm so detached from it. But I feel like in writing is a lot harder for me somehow than working visually. And I feel like that is maybe a break from looking at myself from the outside, you know, and maybe I have the chance to look from the inside instead.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And just your second piece is obviously a newer piece. Love is a White Toyota Hiace. It starts off and you think it's going to be kind of like an idyllic, maybe, you know, a Danish kind of jaunt in the countryside. And yet there's like threat that just keeps coming in all the time, and a sense of like trouble and trauma all through it, from like just starting with the cat funeral to the threats of suicide. And of course, the end with a rape of a teddy bear. I mean, I won't get you to do an exegesis of that and sort of unpack it, but I think, what role do you see your writing, just to kind of keep with the theme of the day, of having in giving understanding to, or alleviating trauma, or negotiating kind of difficult moral space, which it seems like your writing is really concerned with, and in a really sophisticated way, I think.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the theme of well-being, I think, and so many we have talked a bit about it, and many people seem to refer as well-being as a positive thing, but for me, I didn't even think it could be a positive thing. You know, I definitely saw well-being as like that's some kind of a human struggle to try to maintain a well-being. And it's really difficult. And so for me, I definitely thought about the theme as one to talk about, mental health and the connection to that has to the body. And so well-being for me was just such a negative word immediately, or such a.
Because
Yeah.
it imposes a standard? Do you think it suggests that if you fall below well-being, somehow you're failing in your duty as a human being? Or?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
If you have a word like well-being, you have also the negation of that, which
Right.
is the opposite of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it's always, you know when you're sick. It's harder to know when you're well. And maybe some of the expressions of being well, like I get there's trauma all through your piece until the end with the teddy bear, and it's kind of ambiguous. It's not like, I don't know, she doesn't seem that traumatized, but yeah, so I think it's a nice exploration.
No, I mean, maybe it's a happy ending. I don't know.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking. Like it's just it's kind of reaching into a new space perhaps, but yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Matilda.
Thank you.
A real
Thank you
pleasure
so
to
much,
speak
Patrick.
to you and to read your work.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you, Patrick and Matilda. Maybe we can revisit this question in the Q&A toward the end. Let's turn to Catalina, Lobo-Guerrero, and Janice Pan. Janice teaches interpreting and translation in the Department of Translation, interpreting and intercultural studies at HKBU. She's an experienced interpreter and literary translator, and she's published poems in recent editions of Mingled Voices, the International Proverse Poetry Prize anthology. Janice, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, James. To start with, they are, if possible, 3 words I'd like to use to introduce our next speaker: independent, journalistic, and revolutionary. Well, Ms. Catalina Lobo-Guerrero is an independent journalist based mainly in Colombia and Venezuela. The themes of her writing include politics, human rights, armed conflict, and corruption, as you can see from the PowerPoint slide. Her reportage memoir, The Remains of the Revolution, was published by Penguin Random House in 2021. The book was about her time working as a foreign correspondent in Caracas during the time 2012 and 2015. Back then, she traveled around the country, interviewing hundreds of people, including some of the main political protagonists. The work is regarded an extensive journalistic chronicle. Catalina was most recently awarded the Simon Bolivar National Journalism Prize. Her experience is a little bit different from the other writers. She mostly worked as a stringer and has published shorter pieces and columns in a number of newspapers, as you can see from the PowerPoint slides as well. And she worked as a fellow at the Logan Nonfiction Writing Residence back in the year 2015, and a fellow at the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism back in the year 2009. Catalina holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology and 2 master's degrees, one in journalism and the other in creative writing. I think tonight she will read her work, Termites. So Catalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Janice. Well, I had is very different from my usual work as a journalist because it's fiction. It's a short story piece, and well, I'm just going to read it in Spanish so you can also get sort of the idea and the sound and the rhythm of this piece in Spanish, but you can read it on the right in English. Comején. Apareció sin previo aviso como la carraspera en su garganta cuando tocaba el estudio revolucionario de Chopin. Trató de ignorarla, pero tuvo que interrumpir la pieza para toser, y en el momento en que inclinó la cabeza hacia adelante por la contracción involuntaria, la vio de reojo. La arenilla fina y marrón se escondía detrás de una de las patas delanteras del piano. Sin pararse del butaco, estiró el brazo y con los dedos finos agarró una pizca. Era más densa que la cocoa y los pequeños granulitos más redondos y perfectos que el azúcar. Sintió ganas de lamerla y estuvo a punto de hacerlo con la punta de la lengua, pero al acercarla percibió un leve olor a humedad y a pintura vieja, y se arrepintió. Entonces apretó el puño y la dejó escurrir en el mismo lugar donde la había encontrado. Quizás Greta la ahuyentaría con tan solo un ronroneo. Al día siguiente, la carraspera ya era un graznido ronco y molesto. No tenía ganas de tocar en ese estado, pero fue hasta el piano para una inspección. El rastro discreto de polvillo se había acumulado formando un pequeño montículo y su gata negra había desaparecido. Esta vez no se atrevió a tocarlo. Extendió el chal de flecos negro que la arropaba y se arrodilló sobre él. Elevó los brazos, abrió la boca para tomar aire y luego se dobló hacia adelante con el cuello estirado. Y la boca en pico para provocar una tormenta de arena. Le salió un silbido débil y ahogado y los granulitos apenas se dispersaron sobre el parquet. Resignada por su falta de aliento y de vuelo, se puso de pie y se alejó del desierto. Pasó una mala noche dando vueltas en la cama y al despertar sintió un dolor agudo en todo el cuerpo, pero sobre todo en los tobillos, como si hubiera dormido parada. No se molestó en buscar las pantuflas. Puso un pie en el suelo, luego el otro y avanzó descalza sobre el piso frío de madera a paso lento. Fue hasta la cocina por la lupa que utilizaba para leer las etiquetas de los frascos, una jeringa pequeña y un frasco de vinagre blanco. Cuando llegó al piano y lo encontró rodeado de remolinos de polvo, las rodillas le flaquearon. Se tendió debajo del instrumento para descubrir dónde estaban los huecos cabeza de alfiler. No los encontró. Lo más seguro era que estuviera debajo de cada una de las patas. Derrotada y exhausta por el esfuerzo inútil, se enrolló en su chal plumoso y se quedó dormida entre el polvo. Despertó con los primeros rayos de luz acariciando sus párpados. Sintió que apenas respiraba y que un hormigueo doloroso le trepaba por ambas piernas desde los talones hasta la cadera. Se sentó con dificultad y entonces vio cómo a su alrededor, debajo del gran piano negro que había tocado desde niña, se había construido una pequeña ciudadela. Los montículos de polvo cerca de cada una de las patas se interconectaban por hileras de caminos laberínticos, como en un mausoleo real. ¿Acaso los obreros esclavos no paraban nunca de trabajar? Pensó que había llegado el momento de emborracharlos y ponerlos a bailar, hasta que el piano quedara patas arriba de tanto movimiento. Con lo poco que le quedaba de fuerza y de aliento fue hasta el bar y regresó con todas las botellas, que envolvió como polluelos entre las alas de su chal. Destapó las botellas y tomó sorbos de vodka, ginebra y brandy, como si fueran limonada, y sintió que le quemaban la garganta. Tosió mientras vertía el resto del líquido sobre las patas y la magnífica cola de su piano agujereado. Al sentarse en el butaco, sintió que la moridera ya recorría todo su cuerpo. Así que derramó la última botella de aguardiente sobre la trenza gris que coronaba su cabeza, sus pies entumecidos en los pedales y sus manos temblorosas y arrugadas sobre las teclas. El charco oscuro de licor y madera molida habían inundado todo el salón cuando empezó a tocar su última polonesa. That's it.
Thank you very much, Catalina. That's beautiful.
Thank you, Janice.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I feel that it seems that you have brought your journalistic eye into this piece of fictional writing. Your words, although I can only read the English translation, I believe touch the soul even when they just simply describe what she, the protagonist, does. Can you share with us what inspired you writing of this work, which is different from the usual work that you are working on? Do termites symbolize anything here? Thank you.
Well, for me, I mean, I was recovering from COVID 3 weeks ago when I started working on this piece, and the worst of my symptoms was this feeling of feeling something crawling in my throat permanently. And it was, I don't know, I had never experienced that kind of sick feeling before, and it was horrible pain. I mean, I never developed a cough, I never had too much fever, but I just felt like there was something in my throat that was, I don't know, it was a bit scary. And I had recently moved to the place where I'm living now, which is a tropical city, and termites in wood is really a big problem here. And actually the desk that I'm working on, it's a wooden desk, and it has, you know, punctured holes because it was attacked by termites at some point. It's not anymore, but that was just there in front of my eyes. And I started thinking about this thing. And I mean, as a journalist during the pandemic, I had to write, you know, many explainer type articles. I was constantly interviewing scientists and epidemiologists and experts in public health. And the writing that I was doing during most of the pandemic was very scientific, very technical. Everything had to be explained. Everything had to be, you know, named. And so for me, I decided I was going to try something completely different than what I usually do. My protagonist wasn't going to have a name, for example. And I was going to focus on, you know, a more, even though it's very descriptive, I wanted to know what could happen. You know, I didn't have the story already planned out, mapped. I didn't even know what the ending was going to be. That never happens in journalism. You have to report it and you have to know exactly where you're going with the story, but fiction allows you to explore a bit more. And well, you know, I just started writing this and it's like, let's see where this takes me. So it was a very different experience than to what I usually write. And I guess I was very frustrated during all of the pandemic because I like to report on how people experience different things. I like to get really close to my subjects. I like to go into their homes, and that was forbidden for many, many months. I mean, we had very strict curfews and we were not allowed to go outside. And for me as a journalist who loves interviewing and talking to people, was extremely frustrating. So I started imagining other kinds of stories about how people really were dealing with this pandemic in a more intimate way. And that's when, you know, just fiction was a great resource, because what I couldn't do physically, like my head started going to other people's homes and places and imagining the ways they were coping and dealing with this virus.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your sharing. I think especially with the explanation of the stories behind, we will better understand the fiction you described. And I think the good news is that we can somehow now find a kind of output for our emotions and everything, especially everybody now is so frustrated by the pandemic. I'd like to, I know that because of the interest of time, I've prepared a couple of questions, but I'm going to choose one that is closely linked to this year's theme. So as a journalist, you may sometimes, or in your case, even often have to go through and document painful or even traumatic experiences of others. How do you bring yourself back to your daily life after writing about such experience? In other words, how do you take care of your well-being? Thank you.
Well, I think the first thing is you have to acknowledge that you do get affected and it hurts. And, you know, I mean, I've had certain stories that affect me more than others. There's also a difference when you're a foreign correspondent and you're traveling to a place where a war is going on and you see things directly. I mean, I have many photographer friends who've, you know, traveled not to only one war, many wars, and they work for international agencies, and they would speak about how the camera sort of protects them because there's a lens that is sort of between them and the things that they are observing directly. And it's something psychological, but they somehow feel that there's a kind of a barrier just filtering reality to them. And they, you know, photographers are also filtrating the images that we see. They're kind of curating we never see the most horrible pictures. Those are the ones that never get published. But as journalists, when we are covering these things, we don't have cameras. There's nothing, in the way between what we are observing directly. And it kind of hits you really hard sometimes. And I'm not a war correspondent. I don't think I have what it takes to be one. But I certainly have written stories about war victims, conflict, violence, but even things as people being sick in a hospital because the hospital funds were stolen, because of corruption. Corruption also has very direct consequences in people's lives. And yes, these stories have affected me. The first thing to do is write them. There's something cathartic and there's something important about putting in words what you have seen, what you have witnessed. It might help, but sometimes it doesn't. And the stories live with you, even for years, inside of you. And you just have to come to terms with it. And if you need help, if you are feeling really affected by it, you have to speak to people who can help you out. There's this term also, vicarious trauma. Even if you're not seeing what happened, exactly a massacre, for example, but you talk to survivors about what they experienced. When they are telling you these stories will affect you. There's no doubt about it. But I also think, well, someone has to tell these stories. Someone has to document it. Someone has to write it. And for me, it's part of my responsibility as a journalist that I have to do this. I mean, my book on Venezuela was, in a way, a cathartic kind of process because of all the things that happened while I was there. But it was also my great privilege, Not many people have been where I was. Not many people were witnesses to the things I witnessed. And it was important for me to write it. And I mean, I'm not an expert also in dealing with these things, but it is important also for journalists to be honest and to be outspoken and say, yes, this experience traumatized me or hurt me. And, I live with it. And you can live with that. Trauma has also different ways of being processed. And sometimes it hurts more, sometimes it doesn't. But you move on also.
Thanks a lot, Catalina. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. A pleasure, Janice.
Thanks a lot. Back to you, please, James.
Thanks to both of you, Catalina and Janice. So I would like to introduce Andy Brown, and then we'll have a sort of a collective discussion and take questions from the audience if there are any. Andy Brown is not an easy writer to classify. In fact, his variousness as a writer, his poetry, his historical fiction, his collaborative writing, his editorial work, his nonfiction, and his songwriting, they all bring into question the very urge to categorize any writer. But one hallmark across all of his work seems to me to be his deliberation, by which I mean his thoughtful observations. Consider his poem, These Trees, in which he describes the imperceptible growth of tree leaves as, quote, barely noticed inchings on of green. The cumulative effect of his diverse work that spans more than 10 books is a reparative instinct, an impulse to find the right literary remedy for the moment. As the speaker says in the poem, Climbers and Trees, quote, when I climb in the branches of a tree, I pay a soft attention. When I dream, the tree holds me in its unconcerned arms. And everything in Andy Brown's imagination feels infused with a sense of writing itself. In his poem, Havering, for instance, he describes a new day by inventing the phrase, quote, frost-scribbled morning. They say that if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. In Andy's case, all he has is a pen, and everything looks like a poem. Andy.
Thank you very much, James, for that lovely introduction. I love that that last epithet you've just given there. I'm going to just talk about a poem that I've written during this workshop. So 5 years ago, when I turned 50, I spent some time teaching English and creative writing in Shanghai at Fudan University in the spring of March and April. And I remember cherry trees across the city blossoming at that time. And I saw cherry trees in bloom when I traveled south and came to Hong Kong to visit a colleague later that April in the city where you are. And among other numerous flowers and plants, I remember the cherry trees as my abiding memory of my visit to China that year. In the last few years, I've moved to a new home in the southwest of England, and in the garden of our house here, there's a similar cherry tree that blooms with the same blossom, obviously, and that I remember seeing when I was in China. Late in the spring, once it's flowered, my cherry tree's blossoms fall and they carpet the ground beneath. And later still in the year, once the leaves have changed color from green to fiery red, through burnished orange and yellow, and finally brown, the leaves too fall to the ground, where I let them lie through the winter, since they cover up and insulate the delicate plants and the bulbs that are growing beneath my cherry tree's canopy. To have a garden is always a great privilege, but it's particularly been so during the past 2 years of lockdowns and pandemic confinement. I really do count myself blessed. The garden is, for me, one of life's great sustaining forces. So far as well-being is concerned, there's a lot of current research about gardening therapy and green prescription schemes based on scientific research into the healing properties of soil microorganisms, of colors, the properties of scents, and just meaningful time spent outdoors that boosts our feel-good and anti-stress hormones. I spend a lot of time in my own garden and grow plants and vegetables, and I write about it too, which helps develop that well-being in other particular ways. So when we first met together for this International Writers Workshop, James kindly shared with us a poem by the Hong Kong poet Nicholas Wong called Straight City. It has the memorable lines, "Aren't fallen leaves a loss all trees take in?" James said to us that these were his favorite lines in the book. And the lines reminded me of the fallen leaves from my own cherry tree. And they reminded me of the cherry trees that I saw in Shanghai and Hong Kong. So I decided to take Nicholas Wong's lines as an inspiration for this new piece of writing for this workshop, a poem that talks about the cherry tree in my garden as though it were a writer of its own story, and talks of the writing lives of the creatures that come and go around the cherry tree. So the poem is called Garden Cherry Tree as Author. Aren't fallen leaves a loss all trees take in? From Nicholas Wong. Each year, the cherry tree gives an account of herself in more or less the same voice, perhaps a little taller, maybe sweeter, her tail laid down in secret rings of wood. She scribbles her ambitions on the air in polished fruits, while the dog signs his name around her trunk in sprays of scent. The cats write theirs in scats that sour the flower beds. The snail scrawls his ghost signature around the tops of our pots. And as for the mouse, he tells the story of his nights in fresh dug burrows, the pillaging of seed trays, the tattered corner of the birdseed bag, and trails of husks that lead us to his leavings.
Thank you so much. You know, I've been tracking the image of trees and gardens tonight. Maybe you probably have too, but
yeah.
Between Glenn's piece on the forest as this like quivering historical collective memory, and even Marta's piece has this image of hiding behind trees, playing war. Your poem about gardens, of course, but then you've got Matilda's piece about where the garden is a site of memories of trauma. And then, and even Catalina's termites, termites feast on dead wood, and Colin has some idyllic, windy Greek roads. I'm sure there's trees on that road. So I guess I'm wondering, you were a tree climber, apparently, or you've written about tree climbing. I mean, what is it about trees? And trees constantly appear in my poetry. So yeah, what can you speak a little bit about our writer's attraction to trees and the complexity of that reaction or response?
Well, I mean, I think it works. They affect us on lots of different levels. I mean, partly there's something deeply ancestral about it for us as human beings, as primates. We are descended from the trees, and we love to return to them. It partly stems from childhood, if we're lucky. That sense of ascent, of testing your own limits, of getting outside and being free of adult rules and strictures, of being able to turn the world upside down on its head and hang from a branch upside down. I think so. Those are both sort of kinds of ancestry, I suppose. But I mean, forests and trees themselves also offer us enclosing spaces. They're a paradoxical thing. You can be in a tree, but you can be outside. You can be you can climb inside a hollow of a tree and be inside, but you're also outside at the same time. You can be in a canopy, but a canopy is a permeable space. There's something about trees and their structure, which is very human-like. We talk about trunks, arms. We talk about canopies and crowns and heads. Trees are rooted, as humans, I suppose, wish to be, or sometimes struggle with being rooted. I think they speak to us on all sorts of different levels. Of course, they're also just wonderful, beautiful sensory things that affect us in multiple ways. You know, they engage with all of our senses, all five senses, and indeed our sixth and seventh senses of imagination, and more metaphysical senses, I suppose, as well.
No, I mean, I agree with all that. Yeah, I mean, and the fact that trees, apparently they talk to each other, according to recent research. There's some.
Yeah, there's some wonderful research. Yeah, underground networks of fungi, and a Canadian writer called Susan Simard has just published a book called The Mother Tree, which talks about ways in which maternal trees can recognize their offspring and can pass nutrients and communicate with them through their root systems. They can tell which trees are related to them and which are not. Extraordinary, expansive science that's blowing apart our understanding of the non-human world.
It's remarkable. Let me turn to something different. Your editorial work. You, a few years ago, co-edited a book called A Body of Work, an anthology of poetry and medicine. It's just an interesting project, and I wondered if you could, share a little bit about what you may have learned about poetry's capacity to address physical and mental suffering.
Well, yeah. I mean, the book came out of some research projects that I do. I mean, I'm lucky I've got a lot of colleagues in Exeter University who work in what we call the medical humanities and medical history. And so I put together an anthology of poetry, which basically spans from 1750 through to the present day. it breaks medicine down into some groups. So poems about hospitals and other medical buildings, poems about doctors and medical practitioners, poems about the body itself, poetry about illness and disease, poetry about aging, and so on. So it takes a thematic approach, and I was just very interested in the ways in which, you know, these have been written about from across this time span anyway, for the past 250 years, and the ways in which poetry tells us something about our sense of selves and well-being and illness, the way in which it sort of feeds back into our own discourses of science and treatment. Poetry is sort of part of that information loop, if you like. It's a way that we represent our experiences to ourselves. It's not just a sort of an aesthetic and prettification of the debates. It actually, the way that we talk about our bodies is in poetry is intrinsic to our understanding of that. You know, no medical condition is just a medical condition. It's an experiential, lived condition that we that the way in which we think about it and talk about it is part of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think I learned a lot about that, reading all of those poems and looking at a way in which that had changed over that time span.
It's a great idea for a book. I mean, and especially with this emergence, I think we alluded to it earlier, or maybe you did, about narrative medicine and how doctors and nurses are starting to study creative writing and how it can foster empathy and so on.
Absolutely.
Well, you know what? Maybe this is a moment to turn to the group and just open the floor to conversation. You know, I think we have a few minutes we can extend, and I guess I'm interested in, if anyone wants to respond to this question about why how we go to nature for some renewal. It seems to be a feature of a lot of our work. And or we can talk a little bit about the pandemic and how that may have impinged on us in some ways and shaped our work. But yeah, would anyone like to, or maybe there's a question on your mind you want to pose? Anyone can kick it off.
James, can I?
Yeah.
I have a question that I prepared for Catalina earlier, and I'd love to ask her to answer the question if possible. So, Catalina, you have been traveling in different places, and my question is, do you think the locale has somehow influenced your way of writing? For instance, do you somehow feel that you were put on a different hat if you are writing in a different country?
Well, there's something about language and the way people speak or talk or even write in different countries. Even though I write in Spanish, the Spanish that is spoken in Colombia or in Venezuela or in Spain or in any other country of the Spanish-speaking world has very specific ways of expressing certain things. And for me, something that I find fascinating is how these very specific local ways of expressing can actually tell sort of like a better story. It's like every culture or every society has come up with the words or the jokes or the poems or the sayings that really reflect really well what is happening in that very specific place. And so when I was writing my book on Venezuela, some of the titles that I use, some of the words that are included in the chapter, it's Venezuelan Spanish. It's the same language, but I try to include all of that in my work because I feel it's also the most respectful way of doing it, you know. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's that's all I can say about that, about different places and the ways different people influence also your writing.
Thanks a lot. I think that's. I mean, I share the same feeling as well, because I'm recently preparing to write a novel about a story happening in Greece. So I'm thinking it would be nice if I could spend some time there and then really live in the place to be better prepared for the writing itself. I'm wondering whether the other speakers of the panel have something to share relating to the influence brought by the locale to your own writing, if possible. Thanks a lot.
Well, Glenn, you're getting a PhD in creative writing in Australia. How is being in Australia affecting your writing about the Philippines?
It's a weird thing, no, and to a certain extent, I don't think I want to think about it too much. No, I mean that kind of I don't want the entire process to be demystified. No, but I do like observe like several, I don't know, some weird things happening to the language whenever I'm like in a different place. I think what matters to me most when I write is like a degree of comfort, no, in terms of like being okay in a place, no, and of course you can like interpret that and look at that in different ways. For instance, I've like over the past 5 years, I've spent some time in India, in the US for like, I don't know, from like a month to 3 months, and yeah, it does take me quite a bit of time to sort of get used to the place, the sound of the place, the community, the people I'm with, and I don't know, it's probably something about me personally that needs to be like achieve a certain comfort in terms of how I'm feeling about our writing before I really like get down to writing. So I'm not sure if it's like social in that sense or completely like an interior thing, no, but for sure in many ways that I don't like think about, I'm pretty sure like the conversations that you have with people, the sound of like a city, even the food that you like consume in a city, like the entire the everyday life, I suppose does something to the language and the way you think and the way you make sense of things, and all of that I suppose filters in some way in the kind of writing that you do, not just in language but in terms of how you make sense of the world. Yeah
Thanks. Maybe I'll just put this out there, but in terms of well-being and writing, I feel like the pandemic has allowed me to turn inward in a good way. And I just wonder how some of you may have been reacting to the pandemic as a writer over the last 2 years. Like, Colin, for example, you talk about like the importance of collaboration and community and networking with people and just getting energy from that. But under the pandemic, it's probably been difficult. So did you find something else to substitute, or did you collaborate in new ways? I mean,
Yeah, that's a really great question. So initially, I think I found it quite difficult, and I was very busy with other things as well, like with the transitioning to doing everything online and everything. But actually, yeah, I did start finding alternative ways of doing that. So started kind of doing quite a few different kind of epistolary projects of just kind of like messaging, like kind of messaging back and forth with other writers, with the idea that they were like, we'd sort of see what happened and we would kind of focus on a particular thing, and then we didn't know if these would actually be texts that we would publish, and some of them have and some of them haven't, but in any case the correspondence was kind of interesting and generative.
Okay, yeah, just alternative means. The audience is welcome to pop a question into the, if you have a question, that a collective question, especially, pop it into the Q&A box. think we have. There's a question. Oh, okay, yeah, good. Yeah, and feel free to respond directly in the box there.
I can offer something, James.
Yeah, go ahead.
Speaking, yeah. I read this novel when I was spending my sabbatical in India. I read this Bangladeshi novel called Babu Bangladesh, published in 2018, set in 2028 in Bangladesh. And the author died before it was published. He died swimming in Japan. He's a Bangladeshi author. He was doing a PhD somewhere in the US in creative writing, and he was in Japan and he died swimming. But this novel is about, it's the foundation, the founding myth of Bangladesh. So from 71, okay? And there's this super moving scene in it where the students, as Pakistan is attacking Bangladesh, there is a very old banyan tree on campus. And everybody congregates around the banyan tree, and the banyan tree is the symbol of Bangladesh as nation since 1971, you know, founded and fighting against the attacking Pakistanis. And what's happening is they're trying to kill the tree, the symbol of their unity. They're trying to kill this banyan tree. So the students organize night shifts to like to trouble the work of the Pakistani army who are trying to blow up this tree. It's this massive banyan tree and they can't blow it up, and the students resist and resist. But finally, when they blow up the tree, there's another tree at the other end of campus. And when that big banyan tree, the symbol of unity in Bangladesh, is blown up, the tree on the other edge of campus drops all of its flowers and leaves, as though it's weeping in response to this central tree and symbol being desecrated and destroyed. And apparently that's what happened. Because the novel integrates fiction and nonfiction. So it's charting the story of this crying tree, just to speak again to this awareness of tree and tree communication and how moving it can be. And it's just a novel I'd like to recommend to everyone here called Babu Bangladesh. I'll write it in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. That's interesting. I mean, there's a very strong strain of collective action that comes out of India in particular in relation to tree protection. I mean, we get the Chipko Andalan movement, where where the women of the village hugged trees and to protect them from where we get what has now become a rather pejorative term, tree hugger, but is actually a really positive action that originates in from India and also interestingly kind of places in that example women at the sort of forefront of eco protest against destructive capitalist forces, basically.
Yeah, we had talked about that in Richard Powers as well, right?
Yeah.
You know, we didn't plan it this way, but it strikes me that all of you wear a lot of hats. I mean, you know, Matilda, of course, poet, but also this artist. Glenn, you're a fiction writer, but you're also becoming a scholar here with this PhD. Matilda, of course, novelist, filmmaker. You know, Colin, all of your collaborations, and Andy, all of your different genres that you work in. Catalina is a journalist, nonfiction writer. So I don't know what conclusion to draw, but it's very interesting. And we didn't, like I said, we didn't plan it this way, but I don't know if this is like just a natural evolution of the writer in the 21st century, or if all your applications looked especially awesome because of your varied backgrounds. But it is very interesting to me, and I don't know if any of you want to speak to that, but all these hats that some of you seem to wear, or all of you in some fashion.
Yeah, I was, because we had one of the first talks we had together. I remember everyone had to bring sort of an inspiration. And most people mentioned like paintings or photography, which for me was, yeah, I didn't expect that. That was kind of unexpected because of course a lot of my influence comes from visual art, but it felt like it was the same for almost everyone in the group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was nice to see, I thought.
Yeah, maybe it's also a function of technology. Like technology is easier now. You can slide into, I mean, Marta's workshop is going to be on making documentary films without equipment. So there you go. I mean, you can kind of slide into these roles much more easily. Yeah. Well, maybe this is a place to leave it, to allow the audience to look forward to the rest of the programming. I mean, we've got a terrific lineup of events starting tomorrow, and I encourage everyone to check out the panel discussions. You can try to squeeze into a workshop perhaps. Lydia, do we have our poster? I don't know if you can swing it up on the shared screen now, but I want to thank each of you for joining us, our 6 writers in residence, our HKBU writers, and my colleagues. I'm just very grateful for your time tonight. And I want to thank the audience for tuning in and being engaged with the discussion. So here you see some of the events that we have lined up. Please drop by. We look forward to seeing you, and our fingers are crossed for next spring. Hope to see everyone in person. So thank you very, very much for joining us.